hola gente del grupo Grite, nuevamente estamos acá en otro encuentro y tenemos otra vez dos invitados especiales. Uno de ellos es Pablo, que no solamente participa en la charla, sino que aparte nos ayuda con nuestra falta de dominio del inglés. Muchísimas gracias, Pablo. Y nuestra invitada es nada más ni nada menos que Lisa Tuttle. Lisa Tuttle es una de las grandes pioneras del terror en Estados Unidos. Ahora ella vive en Escocia, en la bellísima Escocia, que no conozco, pero sé que es bellísima. Y no solamente es una de las figuras más importantes en la historia de la literatura de terror anglosajona, sino que además es una de las personas que más ha impulsado la visibilidad de género dentro de Estados Unidos y en el mundo. Welcome to us, Lisa Tuttle.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's a really pleasure and an honor to have you as a guest of our meetings because your own work as writer, but beyond that, your work as um, um,
Editor?
Excuse
Editor,
me?
perhaps? Editor?
Oh
or
no, yes, but
critic?
in the way you put in front of us the activities of the women writers and the place they deserve among us is well recognized for the whole community as one of your pioneers of this way of understand the equality and the rights of everybody to be writing whatever you want,
Yes.
no matter who or no matter what. Okay. Thank you very much indeed for your service in this side of the genre itself. Okay, let's kick off by asking you just a generic question. How has your approach to psychological horror evolved throughout your illustrious career, and what particular aspect of the human condition do you find most compelling when crafting your narrative?
Oh, that's a very complicated question. I do think things have changed a lot since I began writing in the 70s, the 1970s, or being published in the 1970s. I was even writing before then at school. I think, well, a lot of things have changed. I mean, for one thing, horror is now probably bigger than it's ever been. Back in the 70s and 80s, there was a lot of discussion about whether it was even a genre. And my feeling as a younger writer was that I didn't really like to be classified as a horror writer because it seemed to be to diminish what could be done. Right. I mean, and in fact, a lot of people have made the argument that horror is an emotion, not a genre. And
right.
there are, I suppose I'm less interested in the most kind of basic, generic horror, but I feel that way about all genres, really. What I'm interested in is individual voices, people really trying to write a good novel or a good story. And when I started, I was sort of more identified as a science fiction writer. But I think that was really because there wasn't, fantasy was seen as a subgenre of science fiction, and horror was hardly there at all. You know, there were ghost stories. I loved ghost stories. And I found I was always drawn to writing stories that were set in the real world. I wanted to look at real people, but then I like to have something very fantastical, strange. And for whatever reason, it tended to be something very disturbing, frightening. You know, I didn't have happy fairy tale endings usually.
Yeah.
And I think I've continued kind of in that direction. I at first I resisted, as I said, I resisted the label But that was largely because I felt that, yes, some of my work could definitely be classified as horror. But others, I felt there were novels I wrote, like there's a novel called Lost Futures or Futuros, Perdidos. It was published in Spain.
Yeah.
It's it's interesting because in the UK, in Britain, it was published as science fiction. And in America, it was published as a horror novel in a line that published only horror novels. It was called Abyss from Dell Publishing. It was very big, very briefly, I guess, in the 80s. And then the horror boom of the time kind of collapsed. So that was another reason not to be identified as a horror writer, because I wanted to write just my own books. I wanted to write about people, but people in, I suppose one of the writers who I really admire was Shirley Jackson. And of course, she wrote The Haunting of Hill House, and The Lottery, many wonderful stories.
Yeah.
A novel called Hangsaman, which is also where she was often writing about, is this madness or is this something supernatural?
Yeah.
And that was the kind of course that has always drawn me, which isn't necessarily the most popular, but it's what I like to read and it's what I like to write. More ambiguous stories.
Yes, indeed, indeed. No, some scholars say that the horror is the only genre defined by the motion that calls.
Yes.
And yes, indeed, when you are a writer or even just going to the cinema, you say, I'm going to see a movie. What kind of movie? Of horror movie. So you are defining the movie or the book by the emotion. In other case, you say, I'm going to see science fiction, I'm going to see one of cowboys on whatever. Anyway, and it's true that for the evolution of the horror as a genre, it till the end of the 60s, when 3 novels in 5 years, Rosemary Baby, The Others, and of course The Exorcist, they changed this understanding of the genre as a under value stuff, and open the gates of the addition of new people going through the genre, and even still the academy of the faculties resent considering us as a genre. Finally, the people and the mass media on the platforms, you take a look to the wherever, any platform, you got 60% or 70%, it depends of the time of the year, is related to horror. So is a boom of the horror, of course, is good and not good, because when you have plenty for choosing, you
can't read it all.
No, but anyway, you are quite right. We understand pretty well the conundrum, the predicament of the time when you start publishing in the early 70s, when yet, besides the Exorcist and the whole stuff that come after, the genre was still perceived as a second-hand writing or piece of reading. Yeah.
Well, I do think that what happened in the 80s, when it became, actually, I think that was when it became a genre. I think at the end of the 60s, and actually in the early 70s, there were individual books, and which is actually what I like. I like, an individual book which comes out and it's great and you like it. It was really with Stephen King, and after him, that more people started saying, oh, these books all kind of fit into a category. So instead of just being, you would have the occasional bestseller, which would just be seen as, well, it's hard to describe. It's a thriller, but it's really scary. You know, it would be something like The Exorcist. And I think Rosemary's Baby was often seen as a more almost social commentary. You know, it is
Absolutely.
it's got witches and devils and that sort of thing in it. But it's quite, it's also sort of a satire. So I think that again, that wasn't really a genre couldn't be built around it any more than The Exorcist. Although The Exorcist was closer to the sort of psychological horror,
Absolutely.
with the ambiguity of, are these people crazy? What is really happening? Is the priest a good man, or is he, just
Yes, they are. We start to playing with the borderline between sanity and madness, and reality and illusion or hallucination. So this became in those times one of the main characteristics of the genre, and psychological, most of them, and still remain in good shape.
yeah.
So
But I do
yes,
think something that happened in the 80s, because I remember it very well, was when they realized books like Stephen King were selling really, really well. So you had publishers that were looking for new writers. And one of the aspects of it was a very down market, a very kind of creature feature, a kind of like James Herbert writing The Rats. And so, with the popularity of Rats, I think it was just called Rats, or maybe it was The Rats, I don't remember.
yeah,
But they then wanted more horrible, animals or monsters. And I had a friend who sold her first book. It was very easy, or it seemed very easy. If you could come up with an idea they hadn't done yet, you could sell it. And this friend of mine, Catherine Potasic, an American writer, she had an idea. She was living in New Mexico, and they have Gila monsters there, which are just these kind of large lizards. And I don't think they're particularly scary unless you're really scared of lizards. But the idea was that this one would grow gigantic. So the book was just called Gila with an exclamation point afterwards. And and other people came up with weird things like there was one about rabbits that suddenly all turned, they gigantic, or they became carnivorous. And I mean, there was even one called slugs. And I thought, but you could easily, as many people pointed out, but you could just run away or squash them, even if they are blood-sucking creatures. It was a bit ridiculous.
yeah,
So, but that was just a kind of I don't know, a pop culture sensation, I would
yeah,
say. And it's not too
indeed.
surprising that some people liked them because they were sort of funny, sometimes intentionally and sometimes not. And it does show actually there can be a kind of link between horror and humor.
Of course,
Because
certainly it is.
comedy, it can go in either direction. And I've certainly written stories where I thought, oh, is this going to be too ridiculous? Or will it be scary? And there are certain ideas that I think.
Is a twist that you put into the story that goes one way and the other, and if you take two steps um, back backwards, uh, and you open the scope, it's quite
My window.
yeah, it's quite interesting that the same situation could be perceived, as you said, as a humorous thing because it's crazy, it's absolutely out of mind, or no matter what is in your mind, so it's real because your brain it doesn't perceive the difference between reality and hallucination. So
Yeah.
it's absolutely true that sometimes you said, "Oh, I'm going too far. I'm pushing the envelope, but people like this because is the tension is growing in a horror movie or book, but it have to sometimes release a little of the tension because all the time the brains is blown. So where we go with the first question of our colleague Emiliano, and go ahead.
Sí, gracias, Pablo. En relación a esta transformación que estaba, o este proceso de creación, de reconocimiento del género de terror, mi pregunta para Lisa sería, ¿cómo fue transitar esta formación de la que hablaba en los años 80, sobre todo, cuando todavía existían prejuicios acerca de mujeres escritoras dentro del género? Es más, Lisa dijo en alguna oportunidad, en alguna entrevista, que se pensaba que las mujeres no podían escribir real horror.
Okay.
Something about women writing horror, I got that, but
yeah, certainly. Well, actually, it is, if you consider the horror as a genre, many people put of course the Gothic, but you have the mother of the monster that Mary Shelley is the mother of all of us. Okay, Amy said that how did you navigate the landscape of horror writing in the 80s when prejudice against female writers were still prevalent? You have previously mentioned that it was once believed women could not write true horror, in contrast to science fiction, where women writers, although initially restricted, gradually began to gain prominence. What was it like to write in the horror genre under such circumstances?
Well, yes, I definitely. Well, the thing is, I think I've run into it in science fiction as well, although there are many fine women science fiction writers, and there always have been. But there was a kind of blindness or a deliberate refusal to see what women were writing. I remember getting into an argument once with Greg Benford and Charles Platt about Charles Platt had published a book which was, I think it was called Voices of Science. I can't remember what it was called, but he interviewed all what he thought were the best science fiction writers, and there was only one woman. And when I took him to task for this, I said, but there are plenty of women writing science. Oh, well, Ursula Le Guin wouldn't talk to me, he said, which is understandable because he could be fairly offensive. And other writers that I mentioned, he said, oh, they're fantasy writers. And I said, well, no. And he's, oh, yes. And they had this idea that, and I think Greg Benford jumped in with it as well, saying, oh, all of these women writers, they're turning science fiction into fantasy. That's what they're writing. And we've got more women editors. And so they're buying the things they like to read. And it's not real hard science fiction. Well, the same sort of thing was happening in the 80s with horror, which was that the biggest names, and I wouldn't argue against it, the very biggest names of people who were alive and writing were all men that were writing horror, and you knew it. But there were loads of women who had written maybe one horror novel, or they'd written something that wasn't published as horror. It was published as, I don't know, a psychological thriller, or as a crime novel, or maybe as a mainstream novel. And short stories, yes, they're short stories, but a lot of people don't reckon that short stories are as important as novels. They always say that phrase, a full-length novel. Like if you're writing a short story, you just haven't somehow managed to write what serious writers write. You just write short stories. Well, I love short stories, and I think they're brilliant writers of short stories, and there always have been. But anyway, what really set me off, I would find myself often in a kind of situation where it was a bunch of men we were all writers, but after a while, it was like they all wanted to try and gross each other out. It was kind of like, I felt like I was being in high school, it was like, and I just remember at one convention where there was, oh, no, who was it? Sean Hudson, Ian Banks, who the other, Ramsey may have been there, but I think Ramsey tended to sort of sit there and quietly chuckle. He didn't act like one of these sort of deliberately bad boys. He was more serious. Ramsey's always been a more serious writer,
Yeah.
also very funny. But, and another thing, there was I don't know if you've seen it, it's probably up on YouTube, but there was a TV show late night called The Horror Cafe.
Yeah.
And I was the one woman who was invited to be in it. And I recently met someone, a young filmmaker, who just he remembered everything. Well, he watches it all the time because it's on, and he was telling me about it because I haven't seen it for many, many years. But he said, I just felt they didn't respect you as much, or they weren't very respectful to you because they were always talking over you. They would all agree with one another, or most of them would, and they would have he said, I always imagine them sitting back with a cigar. He said at least two of them were smoking cigars and just kind of agreeing on things. And one of them was Clive Barker, who was saying something about, I can't remember the phrase he used, but it was always about the dark side and kind of embracing your dark side. And that was what horror writers had to do. And I said, well, I can see that to a certain extent. But then I said, you could take this too far. You embrace your dark side. What are you going to do? Death camps, and start writing horror stories set in Auschwitz. And anyway, I didn't remember, but he said, yes. He said, and then I said, that was a really good point that you made. And yet, because up till then, they'd all been nodding and going, oh, yes, we must write darker things and, more horrible things. And then you made this point, he said, which is very legitimate. But, who was it? Filmmaker, John Carpenter, maybe, had kind of said, or one of the others, had kind of leaned forward and said, yes, dear, but that was all that's in the past, We're talking about writing horror now, which kind of totally missed the point that I was making. So anyway, yes, there was often women were being told that what we wrote was not really horror, because horror had to be manly and masculine and go for the gross out. But everybody knew there were different types of horror. And I think, and I have to admit, my own preference is not to just write lots of gory, brutal stuff. I'm fed up with serial killers, a lot of that sort of thing. But it doesn't mean I only write psychological horror or that all women have to write the same type of thing. And when, what is his name? Douglas Winter, and he had this anthology, Primeval.
Yes.
And in his introduction, he made a very good point, which I referenced earlier, I think, that horror is not a genre, it's an emotion. And he said all great literature has elements of horror in it. And it's not just, this kind of down market stuff. It's great literature as well. And then he started naming names of some of the great writers of the past. Well, every single writer in the book was a man. Now, I don't know who else he invited. He said, these are all the great writers of our present day. Now, he may have invited some women who didn't have time or didn't write short stories or, whatever. He did have a few newer writers as well as or ones who weren't as well known. And I wouldn't really argue with his choice. But they were all men, not a single woman. And his introduction, where he's talking about horror in all of literature, he only named one woman. One woman. Would you like to guess who that woman was? No, it was not Mary Shelley.
No.
It was not Shirley Jackson.
No.
It was not Edith Wharton, who wrote some brilliant ghost stories. It was not any of the women that would, any of, say, a dozen women that would have come to my mind that I would have thought you might at least mention one or two of them. No, it was V.C. Andrews, who wrote Flowers in the Attic, which was a big bestseller at the time.
Yeah.
It was about children, and incest and things like that. And I just wondered, because this was Virginia Andrews, And I just wondered if, because he said V.C. Andrews, if maybe he thought V.C. Andrews was a guy,
Yeah.
like all the rest of his choices. You know, it was almost like, hey, here's proof. Women don't write horror. Women don't
Indeed.
even write great fiction that has elements of horror. So, yes, so that was the 80s. And I'm very glad things have changed. In fact, women are being rediscovered, earlier writers, and being recognized. And I'm amazed. I write a regular review column for The Guardian, where it's science fiction, fantasy, and then recently the books editor said, oh, why don't you review some horror books as well? It's very difficult by having so many books coming in. But one thing that has struck me is how different, even back, I think it was in the early 2000s, I did some reviewing for the Times, the London Times. And most of the books I was sent in the genres of science fiction and fantasy, well, not so much fantasy maybe, but in actually science fiction, which is what I was concentrating on in those days, was the vast majority was by men. Now I get fantasy, I get science fiction, I get horror, and really I'm not sure if it's equal, but I often end up reviewing books that say I can only fit 5 in. There have been a number of times it'll be 4 of them will be by women and 1 will be by a man. And I rarely have an occasion where they're all by men. In fact, I don't think I've ever had an occasion where they've all been by men, because there's far more to choose from and so much of it is good, you know? So I think horror is no longer seen as a boys' club as it was in the 80s. Yeah.
I would like to add, if I may, that I'm a member of the Latin chapter of the HWA, the Whole Writer Association. And it's funny because all the members of the chapter are women. I'm the only one.
You're the only man.
Yes, absolutely. I say, well done, girls. You made it.
Wow.
So
it's the world turned upside down, let me tell you.
Well, yeah, but it deserves it. They are good writers and very good fellows and women. And I say, yes, okay, I'm just the weird over here because I'm just the woman. For good once, for good, the things have changed. Our Fernando will ask you about house of gatherings. Come on.
Lisa, en tus novelas y cuentos, incluyendo tu primera novela, Familiar Spirit, hay una gran atención hacia las casas, los jardines, las habitaciones. Es un tema recurrente en tu narrativa. No son casas tétricas, no son casas que den miedo, no es la clásica casa embrujada, y podría decirse que no están habitadas por fantasmas del pasado, sino fantasmas del futuro. Básicamente, en esas casas podría llegar a formarse una familia, y lo que haunt this home, estas casas, es esos fantasmas de futuras familias. La pregunta sería, ¿por qué esta división entre casas, houses, y hogares, homes, que no es lo mismo? Y añadiendo esta consulta, si en su vida real también presta tanta atención al momento de mudarse a una casa.
All right. Let me see if I can
translate.
I know he's talking about houses and homes, and I write a lot about the house is very important. Is that I mean in what I write? But I couldn't follow the whole question, I'm afraid, especially towards the end.
Let me try. Okay. Houses. Fernando say that houses and gardens play a prominent role in your stories, as you said, both in your short fictions and novels. These are not haunted houses and in the traditional sense, but rather spaces where family means form, and grow. Could it be said that they are haunted not by the ghosts of the past, by the potentialities of the future? The idea of these spaces hold the potential for families that may or may not come to fruition. So why is this preoccupation with dividing houses from homes, which are not synonymous? And furthermore, do you pay particular attention to the homes in your personal life when you move?
I'm not sure about that personal life. I think I realize a lot of my stories, well, it's very important where people live. And it's not always, it's true, a house is not always a place that you feel at home, but it's often where people's lives begin, or they have, I still find myself sometimes thinking back to my childhood home and just remembering things. And I like to know where my characters live. So yes, I've only a few times have I written an actual haunted house story, but things happen in houses. People live out their lives there, and families are the most, or whoever you share your house with, your home with, that's the most intimate relationships, usually. Not necessarily happy, or they can just be mixed. You can be very happy sometimes, and other times there's conflict. And for stories, you always need conflict of some sort. They do play a huge part. And I remember some years ago, there was people have done anthologies of stories about houses, which is probably quite easy to do when you're talking about horror fiction and ghost stories. One story I wrote is called Things in the Mirror May Look Closer Than They Are. And it's about a house that's seen in the distance. And the two characters eventually make their way to this house, which they spend ages looking for, driving around, and they can see it on the hillside. Or in a valley. And that is, to me, that was kind of like an inside out ghost story in a way. Or a haunted house story, but turned on its head or turned sideways. I do. I'm not particularly good as a housekeeper, I have to tell you, but it's just the place where I probably spend most of my time, and it is when I'm thinking of a character. Sometimes what I've had to do is remind myself, no, they're not living in this house, or they're not living in the house where I grew up. And then I have to try and decide where it is. And I sometimes borrow a friend's house to give them. And the book I'm writing now, in fact, I've made it very similar to the house I live in, but I've removed the upstairs where my office is. Also, the house is also seen psychologically. It can be seen as the human body.
Yes.
Your body can be compared to a house, and people do often talk about themselves and other people as if they were a kind of consciousness in a structure, which isn't really, it's not always that helpful, because we are our bodies, whereas we are not our houses. But it's still a kind of a natural way of thinking for a lot of people. And that also, that's another thing that comes up is in the real world, is people who don't feel at home in their bodies. So it's another site of horror. And of course, body horror is one of the kind of subgenres, I suppose. that I've also written in, myself, it's just a kind of, I suppose I've always been more interested in kind of internal horror, or things that are very close to home, very close to the person, rather than a monster that comes from the outside. I think they're kind of, I remember at one point, I'm not sure I would say the same now, but I remember thinking, well, there's those type of horror, which you often see in movies, where it is just someone is like trapped or they're being stalked by a creature. It's the horrors outside, and the person that you're identifying with very often has done nothing to bring it on themselves. I mean, maybe the worst thing, the most they did was go to a house they were told not to go to, or try to track down some legendary, the Yeti or the Loch Ness Monster. But usually they are just a potential victim. And so they're fighting against this outside creature, this outside force. But the other type of horror, which appeals to me more, is that there's something in yourself. You might be struggling against your own desires, or you're in an intimate relationship, and the two of you are, it isn't just one-sided. It's not just some bad person coming to get you. It is, you are in a relationship and the two of you have an equal, stake in it. Or it's something psychological, something maybe you're working against yourself, your own best interest, your sort of split personality even. Did I wander off too far?
No, it's amazing. It's really touching. Yes, indeed. So, Fernando, you got the next one.
Tomando lo que Lisa dice acerca de esa idea de personalidad, su interés por houses o home with personality, la ha llevado a escribir una novela para niños y jóvenes adultos como es Madhouse. ¿Cómo le llegó la propuesta?
Oh, yes.
¿O nació de ella escribir ese libro?
Okay.
How did I come to write that book? Was that the question, or do I want to say something about it?
More or less, yes.
Yes.
She said that your fascination with houses, as you say, imbued with some kind of personality,
yes,
enforced your children and young adults book Madhouse.
Madhouse. I was actually. Oh,
no.
I don't think you need to. Yeah, I can probably explain. That was one I had written a book that was sort of for older readers. I'd met a children's editor who had invited me to, who thought I could write well for younger readers, and I wrote a book that's sort of aged 9 to 13, maybe, called Panther in Argyle. And it was about, it was about something that was in the news locally where I live, that people kept seeing this large black cat, like a black panther, roaming around. And some people didn't believe it. And I started thinking about it. And I wrote a book about it for kind of young teens and kids. And then I was asked, well, would you write one for even younger children that would have like illustrations on like every page or every other page? But it would be of quite a short book. So I'd read an article, I think, about, it's sort of about, that was back in, 25 years ago or so, maybe longer. There was an article I'd read about a smart house and about, we already live in that now. This was back before we had Siri and Alexa and smart speakers and and all these things. But I'd read some article about, all these things that were all these kind of new inventions that were coming along. You'd soon have your whole house wired up, and you would just say to your refrigerator, you would program the refrigerator. And when it got low on particular things, if you were running out of milk, it would just send through an order and it would be delivered to your doorstep, or by drones, maybe. I don't know. But anyway, it all seemed very futuristic, but that it was within the next sort of 10 years. So I thought, oh, well, that could make a story for kids because, it's at home, it's a family. And I thought it's kind of a children's book setting, but maybe the little boy would be the one that would kind of figure out what was going on. And so I had the parents were testing out this smart house. And it ends up with, well, it doesn't end up, the progress of the plot is the house won't let the people out. It decides it knows how to run things better. And it's interesting. I spoke to, I forget why, I was talking to Harlan Ellison, was the writer. Harlan Ellison was one of my tutors and a sort of a mentor when I was young. And we stayed in touch. And I think I must have sent him a copy of Madhouse. And he phoned me up to say, were you inspired by I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream? And I said, well, probably, all sorts of things feed into it. But because I was writing it for kids, it had to have a happy ending. But it is about, really, it's about AI. It was a kind of an early written for children, idea about AI. And that was, it was really short. And yet I remember I had a meeting with the editor and she was saying, well, we just need a little more, a few more things have to happen. And I'm going, how can I fit in any more? You've told me how long it has to be. But that's it. It was very much writing for early readers, I suppose, or, very young readers. And, but yes, it fits in with my interest, certainly in families and living in houses and although I didn't know it then, my fear of AI taking over absolutely everything. Yeah. And I do have an idea, although it's not about a AI run house, but I do have, there is a novel I want to write about, which will be kind of a story about AI. Not that I know anything about it, but I'm afraid of it, just like a lot of other people.
Yeah. Skynet is coming. Yeah. So, Emiliano, you're next. Indeed.
Sí, gracias, Pablo. La mitología ocupa un lugar importante en sus historias, especialmente, según dijo Lisa en una entrevista, desde que se mudó a Escocia. La pregunta es, al trabajar especialmente lo fantástico, ¿usted prefiere utilizar elementos de la mitología del mundo que conocemos por sobre un mundo potencialmente creado en su totalidad?
Good question. Mythology holds a significant place in your stories, especially since you moved to Scotland. When crafting your fantastic narratives, do you prefer to draw on established mythological elements or create an entirely new world?
As far as location for where things are set, I do like to have a real setting. It's my preference. I have written things, obviously, set on other planets, imaginary worlds, but my preference is always for the real world. And I like, rather than just trying to research a place, to write about, I kind of naturally am drawn to places I've been, that I've seen for myself. And when I was starting out, or when I was first being published, it was mostly short stories. They were mostly set in Texas because that was where I was living and that's what I knew. But then I wrote a few, like I'd been on holidays, so I would write about places I'd been. One early story was set in Spain. One early story was, a couple of early stories were set in England. And I am very fascinated by mythology and legends, and because I live in a kind of a place that has local legends. Behind our house up the hill, there's this Neolithic grave. And there are standing stones, along the road. You can see them, like there's one in a farmer's field. Until recent, when we first moved here, it was just this stone standing in the field. And then I guess it was because he had sheep in the field, and maybe they were rubbing against it. He put a little fence around it, but then there was a storm and the fence fell down. So it's now just standing there again. But I've always been, that's something, for some reason, I don't know why, I've always been really fascinated by these kind of stone circles and standing stones and the stories that are connected to them. And so that kind of drew me into Celtic mythology. And I put a lot of that in, in two novels of mine, actually, The Mysteries and even more, The Silver Bough, which is set in an imaginary version of the town that's about, 40 miles where I from here, where I worked in the library for a while. And but I didn't want to say it's Campbelltown, so I just made up a place, and it gets cut off from the rest of the world, and all these sort of legendary creatures and myths kind of come to life. And I do like that, but otherwise I would usually make up, I suppose, my own stories, but put them in a real setting. I think that's what I like. Who was it? There was some famous quote about was it imaginary gardens with real toads in them, or something like that. That's the thing I like to have, to bring the two together, something completely made up, imaginary, with a very solidly real things. Yeah.
Absolutely. Wonderful. Yes, so our next question comes from Fernando, isn't it?
Yes. Ella mencionó Lost Future. Her novel Lost Future was published as horror and science fiction, como terror y ciencia ficción. La novela, que es excelente, no es ni ciencia ficción, ni terror, ni fantasía, y es un poco de ambos, de esos tres géneros. ¿Tuvo problemas al momento de publicarla con los editores? ¿Alguien le dijo, qué es esto? What this thing is? What genre is? Al momento de publicarla. Y si me permitís, Pablo, quisiera agregar una muy breve pregunta. ¿Cuánto peso tienen los autores al momento de escoger sus propias portadas? How much weight has she as author to choose her own covers for your books?
Well, it's been different. Sometimes I've had none. I remember I was shown the cover. Of course, things have changed now. You often get, I think they'll commission an artist, and the artist will do some digital roughs to show them. So it's not so difficult to change. But the very first time I was shown a cover, well, no, it was the second time, but it was for Gabriel. And in fact, you can see it.
Yes.
Ooh, can you see that? Yes. Well, I thought it was horrible when I saw the cover, and I made the.
No.
I'm afraid I just said that and it was kind of like, well, I'm sorry, but we can't do anything about it because we've already bought it, and that's it. So after that, I realized, they don't necessarily want the truth when they show you the cover. But I just felt it was really, really wrong. Anyway, but more recently, I've been consulted, and in the case of, I've done 3 supernatural detective stories, I guess, set in the 1890s in London, about Jasper Jesperson and Miss Lane, and a kind of mixture of actual mysteries and supernatural, impossible things, and bits of horror. Anyway, in that case, when I was shown the first, I was actually consulted. They said, here are some ideas. Which ones? Let us know which you like the best. So I looked at them, and they had kind of like 3 were variations on one thing, and the other 2 were completely different, I think. Anyway, so I said the one that or the two that I'd like the best. And then I think we sort of fiddled around with it. Maybe there was a color we discussed, like, should it be that red or, whatever it was. So I was very happy with that. And then with the second one in the series, they also did the same sort of thing. And I looked at them, I said, well, actually, I like this one, but I don't like, now I can't remember what it was. It was something like, I didn't like the woman's face. I don't know. She just, just sort of rubbed me the wrong way. So they got the artist to do a different one. And I mean, these were all, just things before they were, so it wasn't like they painted something and then they have to throw it away and do something else. So I guess it's a lot easier now. And then with My Death, when it was reprinted actually, when it was first published in Britain by a small press, I was actually asked if I had any ideas, even for the artist. And I had interviewed an artist called Mark Harrison, who, I interviewed him actually for his book of his paintings. And the publisher wanted some text, and he didn't want to try to write anything. So they suggested, why didn't I just go and, talk to him and then write it up? So that's what I did. But so I thought, well, he does some beautiful, beautiful, landscapes and skyscapes and seascapes. Maybe he could do a cover. I have a feeling he charged more than they were used to paying, but I think they worked it out anyway. And then when the New York Review Books wanted to reprint it in their classics list, again, the editor discussed it with me, but she was looking for a piece of art that already existed. And now this isn't the idea that she came up with, or the art that she found wasn't as reflective of anything actually in the book, but it kind of, I don't know, symbolically and psychologically, it really worked. It was kind of, it's kind of two women sort of dancing around each other or something. It was anyway, I thought it was really very, very striking. And I'd never seen any work by this artist before, but she turned out to be a fascinating character. She's deceased, but she had been into things like witchcraft and occultism, and she'd made films, and she'd been a painter, and she'd known all the kind of, I guess the whole weird people and beatniks and everything back in San Francisco and LA back in the 40s and 50s. So it just seemed on all different levels. That seemed like what a wonderful cover. But in terms of my Lost Futures, I don't recall being consulted at all, but I was shown, I know I was shown it before they actually published it, bound up the book. And I was quite happy with the British cover. Do you want me to get it out and show you? Anyway, it's just in my bookcase. But it was a sort of woman's face, and then these kind of, it was just something about, her many different lives. And then when it was published in America, I'm not sure what the cover was supposed to mean, but it was black and red. It
Yes.
looked like it was a typical horror cover. and it kind of looked to me like a mummy, or a mummified person or something being revealed. So,
Yes.
I mean, I didn't object to it. I thought it was really weird, but if it sells a book, that's the other thing. If it's not, what you really want is you want a cover that you like and that will be saleable. And you get people that have very definite ideas, like about what colors they want or won't have. But I've never felt that I would want to be that hands-on. I like working with an art director or with the editor, getting feedback and that's ideal, really. But I would always, I think, defer to their idea of what sells. Like, just because I liked something, it might be a great picture, but if they're going, yeah, that won't sell the book, I would probably defer to their knowledge.
Yes, that's a tricky situation,
Yes.
when you try to put all the things together and try to decide the better path in order to give your representation of what should be the cover and the seeable that the editor or the publisher thinks about it. Okay, Fernando, you got the next, isn't it?
Antes de esa pregunta, Pablo, quedó algo pendiente que es, ¿tuvo problemas al publicar los Futures al no ser de ningún género en particular?
Fernando said that Lost Future yet does not fall within the realms of horror, fantasy, or science fiction. Did you encounter any difficulties publishing you these being unclassified on these genre conventions?
I often have, I've often in the past had difficulties trying to sell books because they didn't quite fit a particular genre. I was quite lucky, I think, with Lost Futures in this country. It was, if it's, I mean, it's only science fiction in the sense of being, well, it is science fiction, I think, or speculative fiction, I guess.
Yes.
But it's also quite psychological. But I read books about the many worlds theory of quantum physics, and actually at one point thought I'd got a grasp of it, but I probably don't anymore. I think I've lost it. But so it was kind of a cross between fantasy, psychological fantasy with elements of horror, I think, because there is a sort of sense of entrapment for the main character. You know, she can't really, she's kind of out of control, you know, and she never knows where she's going to wake up next, what her next life is going to be. So that could be seen certainly as psychological horror. But it was also based on kind of a science fictional notion. And it was, when it was published here, it may have taken, I can't remember how soon after the British publication I sold it in the US, but I sold it first in the UK. And it was nominated for the Arthur C. Clarke Award for Best Science Fiction Novel of the Year. So I don't know, that tells you something. I guess enough people thought, yes, this is science fiction. This fits. And I think the problem in America was the horror boom was coming to an end, and the editor who bought, she loved Lost Futures, which is why she bought it. You know, I mean, this is what you want. You want an editor who just buys a book because they love it and they're going to somehow or other manage to sell it to the public. So she bought that, and then she also bought A Nest of Nightmares, which had only been published over here in the UK in the 80s, in 1986, I think it was, and it never had an American publication. But she was going to bring it out. This would have been in 1990, maybe early 90s anyway. But the publishing, that list was axed. It wasn't selling well enough. And so I didn't have to pay my money back that I got as an advance, but the book was not then published in America. So it was only published, some years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, by Valancourt, when they did their Paperbacks from Hell
yes.
line. Yeah. So
good. It's always the same old. Fernando, you're next, isn't it?
Yes. My last question es acerca de Skin of the Soul, una antología editada por Lisa Tuttle, para dar visibilidad a mujeres escritoras dentro del género del terror. Las críticas de su momento, no las contemporáneas, en su momento, destacaron que la antología es excelente, pero también señalaron que muchas autoras no trabajaban en el género del terror. Lo que me llama la atención porque justamente no había tantas mujeres escribiendo terror en aquella época. Mi pregunta sería, ¿costó mucho armar esa antología, conseguir las autoras para Skin of the Soul?
Fernando said that in your 1990 anthology, Skin of the Soul, features stories by women, and while it received, indeed, favorable reviews, critics pointed pointed out that many authors were not regular contributors of the horror genre. Thus, the idea of highlighting horror written by women somewhat dissipated. The critique has always intrigued Fernando, as there was a little space for, as we discussed previously, for female horror writers at that time. Did you face challenges in shaping this collection?
Well, the difficulty, the book was inspired, of course, by the book I was talking about earlier, Primeval, which, had all men and acted like it was just all human beings, the best writers there were. So my original idea was, I thought, I'd like to do edit an anthology, and I wouldn't say anything about it being all women, but it would be all women. It would just be, oh gosh, really? Oh, I just bought the best stories. However, when I mentioned it to the editor at the Women's Press, who immediately wanted to commission me to do this. So I thought, oh, well, if it's coming out from the Women's Press, it's going to obviously be all women. So I lose that little joke factor. But the difficulty with getting, there were some writers that I asked to send me stories. Well, I wrote to various people I knew and asked them for stories. I also kind of spread the word as well as I could. Because this was pre-internet, just to tell people they could to submit stories. I just chose the ones that I liked. I also asked people I knew, and there were some people who just either they didn't submit because, well, I had some people reply, oh, sorry, I haven't written I'm not writing short stories, I'm working on a novel. Or they would, I even had one who just flatly refused because when she heard how much I paid, because it was very, I didn't get a very big advance. However, those people who stuck with me, the edition I just held up, that was the American mass market one. So there was more money. And so everyone who was in the book got more money once, that was sold. And I know a few of them were very new writers. So they really hadn't sold, a lot of stories. They weren't well known. Some of them I don't think maybe didn't continue writing. But I don't know. I can't think of particular writers that, if you wanted to name some writers who were getting published and didn't send me a story, I'll tell you if I know, if I can remember what the deal was. I did have, in one case, there was one story which had been previously published. It was by Susie McKee Charnas. Well, there were more than one, but Susie McKee Charnas, her story, she'd been forced to change the ending because it was thought to be too horrible. And I just couldn't help thinking, and so did she, that if she wasn't a woman, this wouldn't have happened. But she said, can I just put the original? Like, absolutely. Let's have the author's preferred version. So we did that. Have a look and see if there's anything. And Joyce Carol Oates was a writer I hugely, hugely admired and was a big influence on me as well. So she sent a very short story. I was really hoping to get something longer from her, but you get what you get. Melanie Tem, she was well known at the time, or relatively. We
Great
were
writer, great.
The really big, I don't know. Sorry?
Great writer, Melanie Tem.
Yes, Melanie. what else? Who was I thinking of? I mean, there were just people who either weren't known as necessarily as horror writers, but I was just, kind of approaching people that I had contacts with, or in some cases, I probably wrote to publishers hoping it would get passed on. But there were also, I mean, who were the big well-known? I mean, there were certainly people I thought of that should have been asked at least for, Primeval. But people have there's certainly, I've been invited to anthologies that I haven't had, didn't have anything, working on a novel. The deadline was the wrong time of year, whatever. So it's always a kind of, you never get exactly what you want unless you have, well, you might if you have a very big budget and you have a fair amount of time, I guess, to kind of, approach everyone. And but I was very pleased to be able to have a couple of people who it was their first published story. And unfortunately, they didn't go on to be big names, but those are the breaks.
Excellent. Oh, sorry. If you hear barking over there, is my little Pomeranian that she self-perceives herself like a Rottweiler. Oh, sorry for that, but
I can't hear it. It's all right.
All right. Okay. Well, Emmy, you goes now.
Sí, con respecto a Skin of the Soul, en el hermoso prólogo que contiene, Lisa afirma que realizó la selección de los relatos basándose en buena parte en cómo estos la sobresaltaron. ¿Esto es así? ¿Tuvo esa selección de relatos alguna carga emocional o sensible de su parte?
Amy said that in the beautiful preface of Skin of the Soul, you mentioned that selected stories primarily based on how they move you started. And the question is that truly that the case was or is the selection process emotionally or sensible charge for you?
It's quite a while ago, so I can't remember great detail, but a lot of it really was. I mean, there were some stories, it's funny too. There was a writer, and I can't think of who it was now, but there was someone who had sent me a story, and there was something, I don't know, I just didn't like the tone, or there was something, it didn't work for me. And years later, she was she was writing brilliant stuff. And I was seeing these things, I'm thinking, oh, why didn't she send me a different story? I probably would have bought it. But again, it's it's when people send you things, and in those days there was, you had to put it in the post as well. So and if it was coming from America or Australia or New Zealand, as some of the stories did, it took a while, and I don't think anything got lost. But usually they said, oh, you don't have to send it back if you don't buy it. But because the postage, terrible. But I'm not sure. But yes, I mean, it was a personal book. And so there were things that I bought. I wanted it to reflect my own interests and my feelings about what horror could be. And I did want it to feel kind of a better balance too. I think every editor has a certain idea of a balancing a book. You don't want, if sometimes stories get rejected because there's another story that's, it would be too samey, if you're going to have 3 stories all on the same subject. And it did seem like, I mean, I didn't think it was going to be a problem because I thought these are all different writers. It's not like when you have a theme, and you want everyone to write a vampire story or, whatever it's going to be. And I didn't even, it was, oh gosh, it was ages. I mean, I couldn't think of a title for it either. I didn't start off with a title. Skin of the Soul came, I think, from one of the writers who, it was something she wrote in her afterword, because that was another thing. I wanted to have the voices of the authors heard, because I always enjoy that when, you know, you get a little something about either how they wrote the story or what they thought about the, the whole idea of the anthology or anything, really. But I should probably sit down and reread it so I could talk about it better.
Sometimes happen that when you are so prolific that you not forgotten, but it's in the past, and you never read it again, and you got a slight idea was it
Yeah.
in, and was it in your side when you write you wrote the book. Okay. Amy, you got another question for our distinguished
Sí,
guest.
sí. I'll go with my last question.
Okay.
En 1988, Lisa publicó un libro muy inspiracional titulado Heroines o Heroínas, Women Inspired by Women. ¿Qué significó para ella la experiencia de reunir voces tan emblemáticas para sus respectivas disciplinas, ¿no?
Okay. Amy said that in 1988, you published an inspirational book entitled Heroines, Women Inspired by Women.
By women. Mm-hmm.
What did the experience of compiling such iconic voices within their respective fields mean to your personally to you? What it means?
Right. Well, I think the book was actually suggested to me by the editor. I think. It's hard to remember. It might have been an agent who suggested it and then sold it to, you know, the editor. But I think it was an editor. And I thought, I liked the idea. I had, my previous book had been Encyclopedia of Feminism. So I very much, you know, was thinking, well, it would be nice to do another book that would be nonfiction and that would be something about women. And the idea of this was, I still often think about some of the interviews that I had, you know, with some of the various women. It just, the idea of heroines, it was more to give the interviews a structure, you know, that they would talk, and it would also add something. So there would be little potted biographies of, you know, I wrote letters to a number of women, many of whom said, oh, you know, thanks, but I'm too busy, don't have time for that, or I don't even like the idea of heroines, or, you know, whatever. But that they would name like 2 or 3 women that were kind of iconic to them. They were women from the past that were, you know, they always had admired or something. Or in some cases, it was even fictional. I remember Germaine Greer mentioned Carmen, the Carmen in the opera. So she's a fictional character, but she liked her because she was so fiery and you know, that sort of thing. So it was very enjoyable to do. And the only thing was I was trying to be as true to their voices as possible. And some of the women felt it was too it was too what's the word? Too accurate. They wanted me, because they were used to being interviewed by reporters who would then kind of smooth out whatever they'd said and cut it down. So I don't know. I still remember that. That was kind of like, I thought, oh dear, did I offend somebody? But it was fun. I remember driving around various places, having lunch with Germaine Greer, and had a terrible experience interviewing her. Is a little tape recorder, and I put in a little cassette, put the cassette in, it went, and then either I forgot to turn it over, or when I turned it over, it didn't work. But when I got home, I only had half the interview. And I thought, oh, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? And although I'd been taking notes, you know, it was just, I wanted to have the whole thing that I could listen to and transcribe it and then, you know, slightly edit it. So I phoned her up and said, you know, I told her what had happened. And fortunately, she was, because I was slightly intimidated by her, and she was incredibly understanding. She said, "Oh, could happen to anyone. Yes, come back. Why don't you come for lunch?" And she said, "But I'll tell you what, you bring me," she was living in the countryside. And she said, "Do you have a shop that sells Indian spices? You probably have an Indian shop nearby." I said, "Oh, yeah, we have one in Harrow." So she said, "Well, good, get me these." And she gave me a list, like I want cardamom seeds and I want, this particular type of chili pepper or whatever. So I took a little shopping list and I went and I got those things and I brought them to her house. And she served me a lovely lunch, which was sort of Indian inspired.
What a beautiful anecdote. So we not only run out of time, and we don't want to abuse of your generosity and your kindness. But we used to finish our interviews asking to the guest author, what is, in your case, you up to? What are you writing? If you can share with us, of course, the nature of your writing right now, if you can, sometimes.
Yes. Well, I'm not going to say too much about it because I don't like to when it's a work in progress, but it is a novel. It may be a fairly short novel. It's about, I think I'm about halfway. I think I've reached the halfway point. Maybe I'm slightly beyond the halfway point. That's the question. And I don't know exactly how it ends. I mean, I know the major kind of climax, but then I don't know what goes on after that. And is it horror? This is the other day, I was sort of thinking, what kind of a novel is it? It's I don't know, it's mysterious. There's obviously a kind of supernatural element, but it's not the usual kind of one. And it involves witchcraft as well.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't really think it's horror. I think it's maybe more of a fantasy, but it does have some disturbing. There's one very disturbing thing which I haven't got to yet. So maybe it will be more of a horror than I think, but we'll see. We'll see.
As a writer, I can help to ask you, how do you proceed when you start to write a novel? You have a whole picture of the novel. You previously work in the world building or in the character, or you just set the sail and go the speed?
Yeah, I usually start with a situation. I start with at least one character. Usually there might be two or three, but one main character and a situation and a place. And then I start going. And how much of the story that I have, I don't usually have too many details when I begin. They come as I write. And I don't usually know exactly how it's going to end. I have I'm aiming for something, but then it may go beyond that point, or at other times I've completely changed where it was going to be and have a completely different ending. So yeah, I'm not a big outliner. I don't carefully plot and plan everything. And sort of the story sort of grows.
Yeah.
And the character develops too. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes. He's the voice or her. She's the voice. Okay. So my friends, we got
Pablo,
yes?
no quiero abusar del tiempo de nadie, pero si pudiera hacer una pequeña última pregunta, te lo agradecería. Lisa is not a gore author, no es una autora gore, pero cuando usa sangre,
No.
blood, en sus novelas o cuentos, lo usa de una manera magistral, muy vívido, very vivid. ¿Cuál es su relación con el gore?
Fernando said that you couldn't be cataloged as a gore writer. But anyway, you have sometimes short stories or books where you use plenty of blood all around, and you have a special touch in the way you deal with this subject of blood spread. Can you tell about that? How do you deal with this kind of situation?
I don't know. Each book, each story is different, and some things demand they have to be made clear. Some things you can be subtle about and let the which I often prefer that, to let the reader, envision it. But there's some things that just have to be told. You can't hold back. Because particularly if it's very very unusual, I suppose, or it's something you might not expect, then I think I have to be more explicit, I suppose, and in describing whatever the scene is.
Yeah.
Sí, pensaba en su cuento A Birthday, y cuando ella usa gore, usa muy poquito, pero muy bien explicado la presencia del gore. Por ejemplo, en cómo mancha la ropa, cómo gotea, y tiene una imaginación muy vívida al momento de escribir esos pequeños momentos de gore, que me parecen sublimes.
Yes, Fernando said that according to his opinion, your gore momentum are sublime because, for instance, in the bird, what's the name?
Which story?
Su cuento A Birthday, un cumpleaños. A Birthday.
A birthday.
Oh,
A
birthday. Oh,
birthday,
yes.
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 You use.
There's a lot of blood in that. That's right.
Yes,
True.
yes. And the way you use the dripping of the blood, the stains in the clothes, all is with like a choreography of moments that blood spreading, but is sublime in the way you put all the things together. That it's what we discussed previously, is humor or is horror, and in this case is disgusting or is a lovely piece of art. So according to Fernando, this is sublime because the way you put all the things together make a picture of gore genre or subgenre that made birthday a piece of force that we could be considered a splendid example of how to deal with gore or blood spreading.
Well, thank you. Yes, that story, it does have a lot of blood.
All right then. So we are. We would like to thank you. It's I think I speak for all of us. It's a great honor to having you over here. We are all fascinated with your generosity of telling about the things that as the time goes by, the things are changing, but you have the memory of the how the things are today because they were in another way yesterday. So we really would like to thank you, not only for your time, that I said for your service to the horror genre or the writing itself, because you were one of the you know, the founding mothers of the modern understanding of the genre, and you made a lot of to incorporate to spread the news of the women writers putting hands into not only the kitchen but in the typewriter or in the computer in order to make very good horror stories, as well as the guys do and pretend to keep the privilege of being keep doing. So for us was not only a pleasure, it's an honor, and we would like to thanks again your generosity, your open heart talk with us from the highlands. And it is not, you cannot be it's seen, but I wear a t-shirt with the all good Alistair that used to have a house Crowley in the next to the Loch Ness, and after that, yes, Jimmy Page, the Led Zeppelin guitar player, bought the house, and finally the house set fire, and
Yes.
very properly coming from the good old Alistair Crowley. So,
yes, that's right.
in honor of your home now, the Scotland and the Celtic culture that is impregnating your whole new stories, I wear the t-shirt of the good old Alistair, a very weirdo one. You never know, is he weirdo or is a mad or is a good guy. Like, that's the horror. The final definition of horror, isn't it?
Well, thank you. Thank you. Been
Okay.
enjoyable.
Bien, para despedirnos, aclarar una cosa a las personas que nos están mirando, recordar que la colección de cuentos de Lisa Tuttle, A Nest of Nightmares, está traducida al castellano, is in Spanish, como Nido de Pesadillas. Recomendamos a todas las personas que ese volumen de cuentos que Lisa está buscando en estos momentos. She's looking for the book right now.
I'm looking for another book. Just a minute. Here it is. This is my latest in Spanish. Mi Muerte.
Mi Muerte, yes,
Mi
My
Muerte,
Death.
Published in Madrid just in February this year. Yep, it's a very short novel.
Yeah.
Bien.
Very short.
Tenemos la suerte de que parte del trabajo de Lisa Tuttle, no mucho, parte de su trabajo, por lo menos está editado en castellano, en Spanish, y invitamos a todas las personas a que lean esa obra maravillosa. Muchísimas gracias entonces a Pablo por su tiempo, muchísimas gracias a Lisa, y fue un honor tenerte y seguirá siendo un honor leer tu obra. Emiliano, ¿quieres decir algo?
Absolutely.
No, simplemente agradecer, extender el agradecimiento que ustedes ya le dieron a Lisa. Muchísimas gracias.
Gracias.
Okay. Thank you very much for the bottom of our heart. See you around and keep doing.
I will. I'll keep writing. I promise.
We love your work.
Thank you.
We do love.
Thank
Okay.
you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Bye-bye. Stay
Adios.
well.
Bye-bye,
Adios.
people.
Bye.
Adios. Bye.
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 Where is the little